Hey, hi. My name is Miroslava Brooks. I'm a visiting critic here from Yale. So I just came here for all 3 days of reviews. And so I'm here in a conversation about collage, but more importantly, maybe about Yanni's project. So,
yeah, hi, my name is Yanni. So my project is architectural exploration of a classic Chinese novel called Graduate Mansion. It's also, the Chinese name is Hong Lou Meng. And it's a book about, it involves more than 300 characters and hundreds and thousands narratives interwoven. And so my project is turn this literal form into architecture and bring the fictional elements into a real building. Yeah, so I really like this idea, and also the reason I think it's a profound question is because traditionally, like in Western novel, is always focus on a single protagonist, and also is parallel with architecture that always tend to focus on a single object, like a like individual object. So, but I think for architecture, like so many different people use it, and different gender, people from different places. So we cannot just satisfy all of them by one thing. So I was thinking, based on using this novel, maybe I can create something with multipolarity. Yeah.
right, the kind of multiplicity.
Yeah, multiplicity.
And I missed the presentation yesterday, so I needed a little bit of a background, but I had a chance to really view all the fantastic models that you produced, and really the kind of exploration for you was through the models, from what I understand, right? You almost kind of started translating the narrative of the book into drawings first, but those drawings then were represented more as models, right? Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about that, and then I'll go back to the kind of multiplicity of the characters.
So in the book, the author described where those people, the place they live, and also the landscape and layout, this kind of thing, in a great detail. So therefore I can draw the element from the book, and also put some of my design into it and draw the plan of it. So this is like a story happened a few hundred years ago. At that time, like people density is not that high. So this kind of layout is like a wide spread around. So it's not very efficient for now because it's like high density. So I flipped the plan over as a section and overlay it with Downtown Athletic Club, the section of that, and yeah.
And I wanted to ask you about that because there was something really intriguing how not only you collapsed the section with the plan first, then you kind of collapsed the multiplicities of the characters, right, into the kind of section plane, or it was like a section plane, right? But then you really collapsed the kind of narrative of the book with one of the most kind of canonical examples, right, of Rem Koolhaas's work, the Downtown Athletic Club. And so what was that about? Because I see it almost as a kind of critique, and you mentioned it at the beginning, the kind of critique of the kind of homogeneous modernist slab, right? The kind of skyscraper building, which he talked about, but he looked at it more through the program, right? The kind of multiplicity of programs that are happening.
Like different plans for every floor. So the reason I chose Downtown Athletic Club is because when I read Delirious New Year, the book, and there was a diagram that Koolhaas stuck all this single family housing and become a skyscraper, and also the original road becomes elevator. I think this idea is very intriguing, and is kind of like what I wanted for my project.
Right. Yeah. So, and this is maybe kind of tying a little bit back to the question or the concept or the use of collage. And you mentioned that this was not something that you consciously like explored, right? Or you didn't really kind of talk about it throughout the thesis.
Yeah.
But what collage as a technique allows you to do is, right, put kind of multiplicities of various pieces into one cohesive whole, right? Yeah. And so I'm particularly thinking about the one model where you had, it was, I think in the middle, it's resin.
It's resin, yeah.
Yeah, and it has the different colors, the different shapes, but it does not have the kind of striated floor plans, right, from the Rem Koolhaas's athletic club, whereas some of the other ones do. And I think that one is perhaps was the most successful or interesting because it really is becoming more of your project, and it starts to remove the kind of reference of Rem Koolhaas, right? And really moving to something new, right? It really moving to the project that as you wanted it to be.
Different layers,
but then there are a couple of projects or a couple of models where it looks more like a building. Right, floor slabs with the objects intersected with a kind of courtyard, almost like piece. Can you talk a little bit more about the kind of curvature?
Oh yeah. So at first, when I create that diagram, it's a slab, and afterwards I got inspiration from the traditional southern China living housing, Tulo. Have you heard about that?
The kind of larger circular buildings.
So this is kind of another like collage from Western and Eastern. So I
like
put them together.
You're basically collaging
the cylinder shape and the slab. So I create those shapes.
Would you say that this is the kind of final resolution of that project, or is it more really the collection of all of them together?
I think it's the collection of all of them together, because when I work on this project, I work forward and backwards. I got into that shape, and then I come back to make the resin model. So I think it's not.
But you know what I also wanted to ask you, and you mentioned it at the very beginning, is almost the kind of critique of the developments that are happening currently in China, right? And you really wanted to almost kind of conceive of a different model, right? Something that maybe perhaps references Chinese history. But maybe, and with the kind of insertion of Rem Koolhaas, brings partly the kind of Western, modern, it's almost like a merging. Like you're saying, I don't want to reject one or the other. I want to find a way where both of them somehow can coexist and create something new, potentially. Can you talk maybe specifically about the kind of critique of what is happening in China?
So I was just thinking, because contemporary architecture in China right now, it just exactly the same as everywhere else, like in Paris, in London, or in New York. Like those buildings, like CCTV Tower, the building by Rem Koolhaas, or the Galaxy Soho by Zaha Hadid, they could be anywhere, any city in the world, right? So, but for Chinese people, we have different needs for the. So I was thinking those kind of architecture cannot serve Chinese people specific needs very well.
What would they be? Like, if you had to say, are the needs programmatic, or are they more, again, somehow about how the culture itself, right?
I think both.
Okay.
Yeah, for the culture thing, maybe if there is like a Chinese form or Chinese through a Chinese novel that people know, they will feel more interesting about it. And for programmatically, like Chinese people's lifestyle is very different with Western people, and like also the layout of the room, this kind of thing. Yeah, and also in my project, for the original plan I drew, there are some of the courtyards between buildings. So when I flip it over, so the original courtyard becomes vertical courtyard. Right,
or it's a kind of larger negative void, right? That starts to structure maybe spaces around it.
And start to break the slabs.
Right. Now I want to ask something very specific about the models also. I think almost all of them have a mirror, right, as the ground. As if, and I was just reading maybe into it, but as if you're saying these actually are not really grounded. These are objects that are kind of floating in this almost virtual space. And so I'm curious what your, like what the choice of the mirror actually had. Like it's some kind of specific meaning for you, or was it really just an aesthetic question, right? Like I actually like the mirror and...
Because at first I wanted to make this project a real building. And real building, yeah, like beautiful building. Yeah. So with all the programs, but after I got into this subject, I feel it's like just a lot of things to explore. Yeah. And before I set up a site, like maybe in Beijing, this kind of like high density city, but afterwards I was thinking this is a project from a fiction novel, so I was thinking maybe just leave it
a little bit more abstract, right? No, I think that was a smart choice, perhaps, because I think we can imagine, right, these pieces basically being almost anywhere. Which brings me again back to the question of when you said I wanted to be a little bit more specific about China. Yet there is a sense of abstraction and removal also that I think you were interested in keeping, just like a novel, right? Like something interesting about books is the fact that anybody can project a little bit of themselves into the characters, into the story, right? Yeah. So maybe there is a kind of singular or multiple narratives within one book, but every reader, right, kind of brings something else to that experience. So I think like the models actually act a little bit like that. I'm also curious, and this is totally a kind of maybe banal, maybe not question of making the models. They're absolutely beautiful, and some of them are actually resin models, right? Beautifully crafted, and so I want to. What is the kind of model for you as an architectural medium? Mean, right? Is it kind of the best way to explore actually, or did you consider, right, like having the kind of more traditional drawings, more traditional ways of representing, right, the ideas?
Yeah, I have considered traditional way to present before, like with drawing on the wall. But I tested some of the drawing, but it just doesn't have the quality that I want. Yeah. So. Yeah, I start. By the way, my drawing is like the reference is Lepskin's. Like
absolutely.
Yeah.
The kind of first set of 3 models, right? They're
etched.
Yeah. I mean, they're really kind of drawings etched onto the plexi, but they absolutely have the quality of the kind of Lepskin's.
So I studied Lepskin's drawings. I found there are not that many different of the line weight. And if I use those kind of technique to print and hang them on the wall, it looked different, and so I start to laser cut them on the acrylic, so it looks more have those kind of quality, And also for the model, I chose resin to make all those elements, all those objects, so people can imagine like there's some of the program in there. It's not just a whole, it's not just a thing. Right.
So I don't know if we have any time left. We do. But you mentioned the line weights, right? And so because the etching, right, or the laser cutting really doesn't necessarily have a line weight, right? You can perhaps control it a little bit with the kind of power of the laser, right? But with the Lepskin's drawings they start to really kind of work with the kind of perception of flatness and depth because of the overlap of the different elements. And I think you almost took it a step further because you allow the kind of picture plane, which is solid in Lepskin, right, to disappear in a way, right? It's acrylic, and all you see are the lines, lines in space. And so that's something perhaps that, like as you move forward, I don't know what your future plans are afterwards, but like those kinds of techniques of not even just representation, but really kind of conceptualization of architecture, right, are worth exploring for sure. One last thing with choosing the novel at the beginning, do you think this project really is tied to that particular novel? Or do you see it, right? In other words, I mean, I think a lot of times, like what we start with in the project somehow determines, not always, but it determines how the process evolves afterwards, right? So I'm just curious, different novel, different type of a book, would it lead to different results?
I'm not sure, but at first I chose this novel because I really love this novel.
Yeah.
I read it so many times, and but later thinking maybe some kind of Western novel that involve so many characters could do the similar thing, and the result will be different, but it will be amazing.
Yeah. So for you, it was important the kind of multiplicity of the characters, right? And I think again, like I didn't see your review yesterday, but I saw some of the other reviews, and I'm sure I'll see many more today. I think there is today the kind of desire of your generation, and not my generation, but your generation, right, to really find architecture that can kind of accommodate difference, that can accommodate, right, the kind of multiplicities. And I've noticed it, which I don't think was always the case, even when I was in school, right? And I think that there are actually a lot of projects that are really quite interested in that concept of multiplicities and differences, and how can they kind of coexist in one whole, right? And so, was this the first project when you started to think about architecture that way? Or, you know, when you think about back, like all the studios that you had previously here?
Yeah, for architecture, this is the first. But I studied urban planning before, and I worked in, I studied like collage cities, this kind of thing. So maybe those things bring me this kind of idea as well.
Absolutely. I wanted to actually, I made a note for myself with the collage city, right? And really one of the kind of fundamental things that they were looking at, right, was the kind of critique of the uniformity of modernism, right? And how the kind of working with fragments and working with the technique of collage allows you to maybe look at architecture and urban planning, right? Because it was very much so also about looking at the cities differently, right? So you never mentioned actually the collage city. That was a note that I made for myself when I was moving through. That it kind of disappeared throughout the conversation, and you just focused on the Red Mansion and Koolhaas. Because the one question I would have, and like, could this technique actually start to work, you know, a little bit more?
In the city.
Exactly. Right now you tested it almost in a kind of architectural volume, and really more through section, right? Because there are really no plans. I mean, the plan became the section. And so I would be curious, right? Like, how does that actually technique translate then into maybe larger scale, right? Like the scale of the city, or even if it's the scale of the building, is it actually working both vertically and horizontally, right? And I don't know, like right now I know that you kind of needed to focus, right? And you needed to really just narrow down your scope of investigation. But something that, you know, could happen and that technique could allow you to explore is really working with collage in 3 dimensions, right? Collage really developed more as a kind of two-dimensional medium, right? I was really kind of piecing pieces of other cutouts and things together on really what was a picture plane, right? So they really started to kind of question what is that picture plane. But later on, right, and today collage is almost everywhere. And I think, again, like a lot of students and a lot of contemporary architects are looking at the technique of collage, right, as a kind of perhaps a new way, which is not really a new way, right, to explore different modalities. So, is this it? This is it.
Great. Hi, I'm Andrew Saunders. I'm coming to SCI-Arc from Penn Design in Philadelphia, and I was just a juror on Evan's fantastic thesis project, Pixel.
And my name's Evan Mason. I'm an MArch2 student here at SCI-Arc. Just finished thesis yesterday, and I'll be graduating this weekend.
Great. Well, Evan, it seems like you know there's a pretty strong kind of mature digital project here at SCI-Arc, especially with your thesis advisor, Casey Ream, who I've known for quite some time. How did you kind of get into choosing Casey as a thesis advisor? Can you talk a little bit about the process? Is that something that you had him before, or something that you'd really wanted to work with him as an advisor to develop past projects or past interests?
Well, when I first got to SCI-Arc, he taught our first semester studio.
Okay.
I did not have him, but I was, really interested in the work that he was doing, and I was, close to him because in that studio, everybody is kind of like all the professors kind of teach together, and then just kept my interest, and I'm interested in scripting, and I have some experience in Grasshopper, so I was, trying to expand that and keep working with that, and then as well as Casey is into a lot of more of the more advanced computer science stuff that's going on within the school, so I kind of gravitated towards that, and trying to expand my knowledge in that area.
Great. And so your project deals with neural network processing and big data to a certain extent. Is that something that you had that expertise coming into it? Is it something that you started to explore just for the first time through your thesis?
I would say I definitely had an interest in data and how it can, start to influence architecture, because I think that, now we have the ability to manage it and generate it effectively for the first time, and I think that it's interesting to see where the change is going to happen in architecture, how that can come in and start to influence, form, or start to influence spatial conditions, or just how we inhabit a space.
What were some of the biggest challenges, going forward? So it's a 7-month process, right? The thesis, and you work on that from let's say the end of the spring semester, right?
Yeah.
You work on it throughout the summer. Can you just take us through? I mean, obviously the final output is amazing, but I'm just kind of wondering a little bit behind the scenes for those 7 months. Can you sort of talk us through how that process developed?
Sure. So we had a semester before this in the spring with thesis prep, and for that I actually had a different professor. I had Florencia Pita for that, and yeah, I guess it was kind of where the biggest jump happened, was jumping from that prep semester to the regular semester. Changing professors. Everybody has their own, ideas of where to go with the project, and I think that was something that was pretty helpful, though. Like getting, having Florencia's input as the project was just beginning to be developed, and then Casey's expertise on the technical side of coming in and actually making it happen. I think. Yeah,
certainly both of those faculty members are starting to have distinct discourses that seem probably from the outside very different, but both of them were at Columbia at the kind of late 90s, early 2000s, and so it's interesting to see that project kind of evolve through the students. What do you see going forward? Now this is kind of your swan song at SCI-Arc, and you are in the MArch II program, and you originally had an undergraduate from Kent State. So what do you want to do now with that research?
I would like to keep developing it. I feel like it's only just the beginning for this kind of work, and I'm also excited to see, because this kind of technology is changing all the time and continuously being more developed. So I think it would be interesting to see, as that begins to grow, how that can influence space, because I know we were talking before how it's always a jump to go from these neural networks, which are outputting 2D images and then turning that into spaces or 3D form. But I'm really interested to see what happens when the power is able to reach that it's generating 3D form straight out of the neural networks, instead of having that gap between the two.
Yeah, it's interesting, that gap. You wonder, it's always the difficulty in a lot of these neural network projects is the images are so compelling as two-dimensional images, and then the real work for the architect is to then generate the three-dimensional space out of those images. And it seems, on one end, it's highly technological and has a sort of aesthetic of technology. And on the other hand, that sort of process of examining the spatial consequences of two-dimensional images has been something that architecture have been doing for a long time. For instance, my own research on the Baroque, someone like Henrik Wolflin writes that the Baroque is painterly, meaning that it starts to borrow from the illusions of Baroque painting and starts to act to behave in a similar manner. So it's interesting. It seems like kind of a very new project and a very old project at the same time. Yeah. And maybe I always wish that there was some maybe a cleaner transposition between that complexity in two-dimensional image and then carrying it over into 3D, because it seems like a lot of the attempts now are pretty crude just because of the high amount of information. But I think maybe that kind of forced transposition and that authorship are maybe the real interesting area. So if it was so direct that it went directly into 3 dimensions, maybe there would be lack of kind of interpretation up to the architect. Yeah. I don't know. It's a good question. Not there yet.
Yeah, because I definitely feel like there was, there's multiple ways to go from that 2D to 3D, and I think just trying to select the right one, and you're right, it could have it has a huge impact on the 3D space depending which method you try to go about.
Yeah, the thing that I really liked about your project is in that jump, it seems what was key for you is to bring in Mies van der Rohe and the idea that the information that you're sampling on one hand for the neural networks already had an embedded architectural logic seems to be a real breakthrough for the project in order to get outside of that two-dimensional realm to bring that in. How did you come about that? When did you introduce Mies into the project?
Mies came in pretty early. As soon as it started to turn into architecture, like I did some preliminary studies that weren't exactly architecture, but just working with the neural networks, trying to understand them some more. But Mies came in pretty early. I tried to do some stuff with some Baroque plans beforehand, but they just weren't as successful as the Mies. I think what makes Mies interesting for the project is that I wanted it to be not so far-fetched. I wanted it to be in reality, and I think that using the Mies plan was able to keep me in that reality because of the construction logics and just the the simplicity of like actually building a space like that. So I think that's where Mies helped me out, and then it also comes into, like we were discussing, putting Mies in Tokyo, and I think you brought up the critical regionalism and how it's kind of similar to that.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you have that just incredible image of all of the density of the information. So at that point, it seems the Miesian gives you that sort of extruded plan logic in order to edit, but the elevation comes from different source material, comes from images from Tokyo, other facades, and these kind of things. So it always begs a question, what is that indexing doing? Does it have to be Tokyo? Do you have to index Tokyo when you're in Tokyo, for instance? When it moves to another site, does that mean that you would then index that site? And would there be a difference? Is it only image difference, or is it no longer Mies? You need to bring in somebody else at different areas. I think there's a lot of provocative questions that your thesis asks about those. So probably ones you'll be asking yourself for a while.
Yeah. I think it was interesting, and something that I wish had gotten brought up in the review, in that we're talking about which material is being sourced and the influence that has on the technology and then influences the architecture. The base image for the plan was actually an image of the site in Tokyo. So it's interesting, when thinking about that, like moving to a different context, like a different site would produce a different, even still using Mies would produce a different plan, different types of spatial conditions. and then it's interesting going from Tokyo to Mies and then back to Tokyo in elevation. It's like fully wrapping it. So place in a different place somewhere in Ohio or New York would produce an entirely different
Yeah, it's
different
interesting,
project.
that both the source material, Mies in plan, and then Tokyo in elevation are pretty familiar, right? The brick house is very familiar to any architects, and certainly images of Tokyo facades put back into Tokyo is familiar, and it seems that through the process of the neural network is a way of defamiliarizing that information. So at one end it does become contextual, but a defamiliarization of both the context of Tokyo, but also the context of the kind of interior of architecture debate within things. So it's pretty interesting. I wonder, do you find the project as it exists now has vestiges of Mies still spatially in those, or do you think?
I think so. There's it is kind of a jump because the brick country house is very different from a it's a single family residence versus the project I was working on was a much larger scale housing project, and I think it's interesting in taking those different types of living and then kind of mixing them together with the use of the technology. But I think that there's still, I think you can read the brick country house pretty well in the plan, just the straight orthogonal.
I mean, the
structure.
funny thing is that if you take the original Mies van der Rohe brick country house, it's a lot about it is extending back into the kind of transparency of the landscape. And the funny thing is you end up with a really dense and opaque project that seems less about that kind of extension. So it's an odd take on Mies. But
Yeah.
We have 2 minutes here. What's the plan now for the project as you kind of move out? Are you planning to teach? Do you want to engage teaching to continue this on, or would you like to engage the professional world for a while, or both?
I think I would like to experience the professional world. I came straight from my undergraduate degree here to SCI-Arc, so I think that there's still a lot of real world experience that I'm missing out in, but I would love to, come back and teach later on. I think so. It's really fun, being here at SCI-Arc, being around all of these, speculative projects, and I think that, I think that that's something really interesting, and teaching allows you to kind of stay in that realm of, talking about the high end of architecture and design.
Certainly.
Yeah.
All right, I think we're wrapping up here.
Okay.
Yeah, great project.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ivonne Santoyo Orozco. I'm originally from Mexico City. I'm a historian and a theorist. I have been based in London, and at the moment I did my PhD there at the Architectural Association, and at the moment I'm in the Midwest. I'm an assistant professor at Iowa State University.
Okay, hi. My name is Haowen. I'm from China, and I'm currently Mark 1 student from SCI-Arc. Hi.
Yeah, so let's talk about your project. Can you just begin by describing it?
My project is focused on 2 problems. One of them is trying to reduce death for the people who want to cross border. And the second problem is try to create more space for families who has been separated from 2 countries. And I want them have enough space and dignity to meet each other. For now, they can just touch each other through the grids by fingers, only by fingers. I don't think that's a good way for kids to meet their parents, especially. So basically, it's focused on solving these 2 problems.
Yeah. So there is the question of the border, of the U.S.-Mexico border, but there's also the question of belonging, right? Of who belongs in what side of the border, and how do we negotiate this? How do we talk about that? So, I mean, one of the strategies you began to enter into the project was to reorient
Right.
90 degrees the border.
Yeah.
So the line that is normally conceived as the border, what you did was to begin kind of the conversation by shifting this 90 degrees, right? And that to me is actually very interesting because what it begins to fragment this kind of simplified idea of what the border, what two different kind of entities are, right? So instead of talking about the line, we begin to have a different conversation about a region, about kind of like a shared space of negotiation, and which is not anymore delineated by the boundary, but it can be delineated through kind of like a negotiation between these two. So I guess one of the first questions I would like to know is like, how did you begin to think about reorienting the border?
Actually, first of all, this is a totally conceptual scheme, right? So actually for me, this is more like a attitude than a building. So I want the attitude to be very clear and strong. Because like what I mentioned before, at the very beginning, I want to against the border wall. But later, I noticed that the wall is a wall. The wall is an object. But nothing good, nothing bad for the wall. The problem is the intention of building a new wall. So later, I tried to against the intention. Because the intention is trying to simplify all the problems in the border area, right? Just put a wall there. That's totally not fine for me.
Yeah.
So I'm very lucky to find a site which just crossed the border. And in the history, I found a lot of site photos of the in the history, and this site was a river. Now it was a river basin. Now it's dry out. Just across the site, so I just use it as my project site.
So what you're saying, part of what you're saying is that actually you started the project with a position.
Yeah.
Like you didn't start with kind of just like.
Oh, I did. I started with the researches.
Yeah, but you started with a position of, okay, I'm not going to deal with the border as a line, but and I think it's kind of interesting. There is so much interesting work right now trying to redefine the border, and I'm sure you have like run into, for example, concepts of ecological citizenship, where it's not anymore about the line itself. It's about, for example, the series of watershed and like how the line is not just about dividing, but it's also about looking about what begins to relate these two different territories. And of course, you know, like you can, the clearest example is watersheds, like all the different kind of like systems of water that transgress the border, that cannot simply stop in the line, right? That transgress, because that is an example that already begins to problematize the line. Like questions of bird migrations, questions of animal migrations, but of course, like the one that you're centering is one that is even, that to a certain extent, it seems like the border has certain control over it, which is the question of migration. And that is where I think it's an incredibly complex problem, and it's not possible to reduce that to this single line. But I thought something that was very interesting is like, okay, you begin by reorienting this, by saying like the conversation is not about the line, it's about kind of the shared spaces between them. But the second thing you began to talk about is that your space, the space you're creating, it's a series of fragmented walls, right? Like you're not presenting a whole as an architectural project, a single entity. It's actually a type of project that begins to kind of fragment the space. There are multiple walls, so your project it consists on a field of walls, right? On a field of kind of distorted walls. And you are you're locating the entrance in the space in between the two nations, right?
Two fences.
Yeah?
In between the two fences.
In between two fences.
Yeah.
So this is actually, and everybody within that space can experience this. Can you talk a little bit about what is the experience once you enter into the space, and once we begin to kind of see what is a space in which suddenly we begin to belong together, and how that might reflect contradictions that we might have actually find outside?
Actually,
Because it's not just about like being in the same place, it's also about kind of being in the space, and also in being aware that there are some contradictions that pull you apart, right? So can you talk a little bit about that?
actually, I didn't put too many attention to the interior underground. Just underground is just simply a display space for a lot of information. Like in the presentation, I mentioned like show people how cruel the condition and the history of immigration. Just show them something, inform them the current condition, that they can get the information, they can be informed, and they make a decision by themselves if you want cross or not.
But the question is like, it's not that you can actually decide whether you can cross sometimes or not, right? It's there are other
people cannot cross in the area. Yeah, they can step in and step out, but they can just go through it. Yeah. And the main space is on the ground. The glass group, glass wall groups, and with the big wall, curved wall. So what I want to show people is when the sun set, all the names will project on the big wall. So,
yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that. So once you create this field of walls, this is something that was a subject of debate within the review. You kind of render, you name the people that have unfortunately passed away attempting to cross the border. So there is the reference, of course, a very present reference to Maya Lane, right? Okay. Of whether you begin to kind of engrave those names into the materiality of your building. I mean, perhaps this is the part in which I will begin to disagree, of course, I don't know, with your project. Because it's an ongoing situation, right? And by naming only a few of those of people that we know their identity, it might begin to create a picture that the event is complete, perhaps, and. But what happens with all this extra, like with all this, with the nameless? What happens also with this idea that the situation this is not a memorial. This is a problem that is still ongoing. A memorial is something that is in the past. This is a space of ongoing controversy and debate, right? So can you talk a little bit about like your decision to engrave on the walls the name of those that passed away?
You mean the reason why I picked those names? Or the reason I select those names?
Yeah, I mean on the walls you have projected. You in the renders of your project, right. You have engraved onto the walls the name of the victims of crossing the border.
Yeah.
What was the decision behind that?
A lot of people trying to cross the border still want to cross border. They don't know exactly the condition, and they don't know how many people did that before. They know nothing. The only thing they know is they want to cross border and have better life. But what I want to do is show them this. You can see a lot of people there. These people have the same intention before, and they are here, but not that simple. But this is the most important intention, to show them this. It's part of the information as the information underground, part of it. The same function is to inform them. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I think again, just to kind of like talk about this as just to kind of like put things together. Again, the question of belonging and how architecture begins to materialize this thing. I think is something that we can only through materiality, through space, evoke, but never fully capture. And yeah, I will. And then the other issue of belonging at a almost geopolitical scale in reorienting, creating a space of extraterritoriality within what is otherwise kind of divided, right? Yeah. So, what is the crucial thing you want us to keep from your project?
Crucial thing.
The most important thing, yeah,
Most
that you might
important
take to the next after you graduate from SCI-Arc.
Actually, I really cherish every opportunity to do something for the weak group.
Let me put it differently. You
Okay.
deal with a very highly political issue.
Okay, yeah.
That's what is important here.
Yeah.
And you began with a position. I hope you keep like dealing with this kind of subjects and with the responsibility that comes with that.
But actually, most people avoiding that, avoiding about political question, you know.
But architecture cannot avoid relations of power, and of course you took a straight face.
But you know how many people stop me to doing that?
Don't let them. Yeah, don't let them. I think at different scales, this relation operates in multiple dimensions, in multiple scales. So I hope you keep on doing that. Yeah. Thank you.